All right, guys, good morning. Hopefully, this can help make a little sense of cladistics as well as cladograms. Yesterday, you did a cladogram without really knowing it was a cladogram with the cell phones, where I gave you the characteristics that the cell phones had, and then you were to put the cell phones in order based on which characteristics they had. Okay? But now we're going to look at the more biology portion of this and look at what cladistics is, as well as how to read and make a cladogram. So first off, what is cladistics? This is the method of organizing organisms into species, groups of species that inevitably are called clades. Okay? So each clade consists of an ancestral organism and every single one of its evolutionary descendants, so everything that came from it. Okay? Members of a clade will possess common characteristics as a result of their shared evolutionary lineage. Those characteristics are what are written along the bottom of the cladogram. And therefore, that these clades, these groups of organisms, can be organized into branching diagrams, which ultimately are the cladograms. These are what they refer to as tree diagrams, where each branch point represents the splitting of two new groups from a common ancestor. Okay? Divergent evolution, okay? Where one point splits into two organisms. Okay? Divergent evolutions. Okay? The point is also called a node, so that represents the speciation event that caused two distinct species to form. Okay? Divergent evolution. Okay? The fewer number of nodes between each group means that they are more closely related. So if we look at species number 1, we have species 1, 2, and 3. Where my cursor is are the nodes. Okay? So between 3 and 1, there are 1, 2 nodes. So in this case, 1 and 3 are not very closely related. 1 and 2 are much more closely related because there's only one node that separates them. Okay? Just some other examples there. Okay? I also wanted to show you a human cladogram. Okay? So kind of outlines the evolutionary history of humans as well as other primates. Okay? And remember what I said, you did not come from a monkey, you are just a close relative of a monkey. Okay? So humans, chimpanzees, gorillas, orangutans, gibbons all belong to a common clade called hominoids. Hominoids is part of our classification. So if you look, here we are, humans. We are more closely related to the chimpanzee than we are gibbons because we have more nodes that separate us. Kind of like almost like a timeline. Okay? So when we read the cladograms, okay, we read them left to right, like you would normally. Okay? We have the characteristics along the bottom and the organisms along the top. Okay? It kind of moves in an upward stair pattern. Okay? So lamprey, shark, salamander, lizard, tiger, gorilla. Okay? Along the bottom, jaws, lungs, dry skin, hair, no tail. Okay? This is the point of the characteristic. Everything to the right, every organism to the right of the characteristic has that characteristic. Anything to the left does not have that. Okay, so jaws. So the shark, salamander, lizard, tiger, and gorilla all have jaws. The lamprey does not have jaws. Same thing with lungs. Everything to the right of lungs has lungs. Everything to the left does not have lungs. So the shark and the lamprey do not have lungs, but the salamander, lizard, tiger, and gorilla do have lungs. Okay? And it just continues on that way. So let's look at an example. Okay? So whole different array of organisms all organized in a different way than the previous one. Okay? So sharks, ray-finned fish, amphibians, primates, rodents and rabbits, crocodiles and birds. Okay? The characteristics are on red lines in this case. Okay? So vertebrae, okay? So this is the point of origin. This is the point where we're starting. This is what we would consider to be almost an outlier characteristic. Okay? So everything to the right along the trunk of the tree, okay, if we consider this to be the trunk, everything to the right of that characteristic, those organisms have that characteristic. So all of these animals have a backbone. Bony skeleton, everything to the right of this has a bony skeleton. Sharks, surprisingly, don't have a bony skeleton. They have a very unique skeletal system where all of their bones are actually made out of cartilage. That's the stuff that makes up your nose and your ears. Okay? You may or may not have known that. Okay? Forelimbs. Okay? We know that fish don't have limbs. They don't have legs. They don't walk. Okay? But everything to the right of forelimbs has forelimbs. Okay? You can see that. Okay? One of the different things with this one is we have some extra branching going on up here. Okay? So an amniotic egg just means that that is an egg that has almost like a fluid inside. Okay? We know that rabbits don't lay eggs, and we know that primates don't lay eggs. The egg is internal, okay? But it's inside of a amniotic sac, which contains all the amniotic fluid when the baby is born. Okay? So the amniotic egg, still all four of these would have an amniotic egg. Okay? As we continue to branch, if we're traveling up the tree, okay, the next characteristic is eggs with shells. Okay? Crocodiles lay eggs, birds lay eggs, they both have shells, that's correct. But if I travel up this way, okay, they have eggs, but the egg does not have a shell. The characteristic that splits them apart is that they have hair. Okay? Primates have hair, rabbits and rodents have hair. These guys do not have hair. Okay? Just an example. So let's look at making a cladogram. Okay? So actually constructing it, drawing one out. Okay? There are 4 key features that are normally present in a cladogram: the root, the nodes, outgroup, and clades. Okay? The root, okay, is your initial common ancestor, the LUCA, last universal common ancestor. It's usually what that represents. The nodes each represent a hypothetical common ancestor, a speciated event. Okay? So the nodes, you can see them marked here. This is where the divergent evolution occurs. Your outgroup is the most distantly related species in the cladogram. Okay? So it's the furthest point of comparison. Okay? This would be your outgroup. Okay? C is not very closely related to the other two. The clades, common ancestor of all of its descendants. Okay? So A and B would be considered a clade in that sense. Okay? So cladograms can be constructed based on structural features, so what you can physically see, or molecular evidence, DNA. Okay? Normally in the past, structural features were the only thing that were used to construct cladograms, but now that we know about DNA and we can look at DNA, that is the preferred method to characterize and classify organisms using the molecular evidence. But it's easiest for us and our purposes to use structural evidence because we can see that. Okay? We can use pictures and see those features. So we're going to organize the selected organisms according to defined characteristics. You want to use characteristics that are developmentally fixed, okay? Something that they're born with, not something that potentially was influenced by environmental pressures. Okay? So environmental pressures are different things like not being able to have enough resources, okay? A change in temperature, drop in temperature, things of that nature. Okay? So in this example, we have our data chart. Okay? The organisms over to the left, characteristics along top, just like the cell phone example that you did yesterday. Okay? So vertebrae, 4 limbs, amniotic egg, eggshells, hair, and fur. Okay? Now I know that not everybody is full of knowledge when it comes to animals. So if you don't know a characteristic, you have the internet at your fingertips. Look it up, see if that organism has that particular characteristic. Okay? Frog, rodent, lizard, gorilla, fish, bird. Okay? All of these have a backbone. Check those off. Okay? 4 limbs. Which ones have 4 limbs? They all have 4 limbs, except for the fish. The fish does not have 4 limbs. So everything that has 4 limbs gets a check. Amniotic egg. The only organisms that have an amniotic egg are the rodent, the lizard, the gorilla, and the bird. They all get check marks. The dashes mean that they do not have that characteristic. Eggs with shells. Lizards lay eggs with shells, and birds lay eggs with shells. Hair and fur. There's only 2 guys in that category. We got the rodent and the gorilla. Okay? So once you have the data, it becomes a little bit easier to arrange the organisms on the actual cladogram. Okay? So let's look at the next slide where the cladogram is actually drawn. So we organize the organisms according to their shared characteristics. So each characteristic is represented by the node, with the more common characteristics representing earlier nodes. The species that has the least number of common characteristics becomes the outgroup. Okay? So the fish, again, I'm going to pop back, your fish only has one of these characteristics. There's dashes in all these columns except for this one. So it has the least amount of common characteristics. So he goes here. He's the outgroup. Okay? The characteristic that he had and that everything else had was the vertebrae. So the vertebrae is the first characteristic. So from this point, which includes the fish, everything to the right has vertebrae. The next characteristic we used was 4 limbs. From this point, everything has 4 limbs. If we go back, only the fish didn't have 4 limbs. Amniotic egg. From this point on, which includes this little bracket, everything has an amniotic egg. The thing that separated the reptiles and the birds was the egg shells. So that characteristic goes here. The other 2, the rodents and the primates, the thing that separated them from the reptiles and the birds were that they had hair and fur. Okay? So there you go. Let's look at this example. Cladograms are not always done on animals. That, in my opinion, they're the easiest ones because most of the stuff you've seen on television about animals is more or less correct. They're also done with plants. Okay? And you all know my feelings about plants and how photosynthesis and cellular respiration are not my jam. Okay? But I do want you to see that it can be used with trees and plants as well. Oops, sorry. So this one is, again, we're still reading from left to right, but it's in a different orientation. Okay? So we have all these different types of trees, okay? And we can see at this point, this is the LUCA, this is your universal common ancestor. Okay? The more nodes that are in between a species, the least related they are. So the sable palm tree, okay, here's this node, one node that separates the sable palm from most other things. But when we get into here, there's a lot of lines, there's a lot of nodes. Okay? So the American holly and the dogwood tree, one node separates them. But if I look at the dogwood tree and the sable palm, if I travel down the line, okay, 1 node, 2 nodes, 3 nodes. So there's 3 nodes that separate the dogwood tree and the sable palm. Okay? So American holly, dogwood are more closely related than the dogwood and the sable palm. Okay? Just follow your lines, and where you come to an intersect, that's considered to be a node. Hopefully this is going to help you with your assignment today. Okay? I'm also attaching a video by another teacher. Okay? If you don't understand mine, I suggest looking at theirs. These notes, they're not something that you need to write down. This is just my explanation on the notes that you would have had in there anyway. We would have done a whole lot of extra cladograms and practice in class, but we're going to have to do it virtually because of the COVID-19. So hopefully this helps. Again, remember that I am available through Zoom. I am available through email, Remind. If you want to do a Zoom meeting, conference call, webinar, whatever, you just have to let me know so that I can set it up and get you the code link so that you can access it. Okay. Stay healthy, stay well, get your stuff done, and hopefully I'll see you soon.